Hello everyone, thank you all for joining us and welcome to the second episode in the Idwal Insights webinar series with a focus on climate action, which is a running programme of content designed to help tackle the biggest issues and challenges that the shipping industry is facing as we strive towards a more sustainable future. My name is Adam Compton and I'm the Head of Sales here at Idwal, and I'll be hosting today's session which, having gone through the upcoming EEXI regulations on a previous webinar, will now be helping to break down the second major change coming into force by answering the question, what is CII? I'm once again joined by my colleague Stefan, Idwal's Head of Marine Standards and Technical Lead on our sustainability initiatives. Supporting him today will be my colleague Ben Thomas. As a brief introduction, Ben is an ex-seafarer having sailed on vessels in the offshore and cruise sectors, and since coming ashore has worked on the commercial desk of a major ship operator and is now a member of the customer team here at Idwal. If I could, please can I ask that everyone remains muted for the duration of the webinar, and any questions can be typed into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the session. Now, I'd like to hand over to Stefan, who'll be answering the major question of the day, what is CII?
Thanks, Adam. And as you mentioned, today we're looking at the Carbon Intensity Indicator score, or the CII score. Now, in our last webinar, we learned that the EEXI is a measure of the energy efficiency of the technology and design of a vessel. But the CII is a measure of the vessel's operational efficiency, or how efficiently it's being operated based on the actual amount of fuel consumed in a year. Again, it's a calculated score, and it's measured in two potential ways: the AER, or the annual efficiency ratio, or the CG dist, which is a shorthand for capacity gross tonnage distance. So the AER is effectively for cargo vessels, and the CG dist for passenger or non-cargo carrying vessels. So the units of the score are the same as that for the EEXI, which is grams of CO2 per ton mile, effectively measuring the amount of CO2 created per unit of cargo carried a certain distance. So the difference, therefore, between the EEXI and CII is the difference between the theoretical amount of CO2 a vessel might produce based on its design and the actual amount based on the fuel it's consumed. And here's the basic formula for it. So this score is actually calculated from the consumption and distance travel data provided to the IMO DCS, the IMO Data Collection Service, every year. And this is a requirement that's been enforced since 2019. The CII, which is based on the AER calculation, is similar to the Energy Efficiency Operational Index, the EEOI, which has been around for a while. Some people may be familiar with it, but it's got one key difference. And if we compare the two scores, we can see that the fuel consumed, fuel type, distance traveled, that data is all the same, taken from the data supplied to the IMO DCS. But the key difference is that the EEOI uses the actual amount of cargo carried as its capacity, whereas the CII uses the vessel's deadweight. So while the EEOI is actually more accurate in terms of the carbon produced, the CII is easier to calculate. The EEOI is in use as a measure of efficiency with non-regulatory organizations and bodies, and it's not a statutory requirement, whereas the CII is a statutory requirement and is enforced requirement from the IMO, really enforced through the flag states and the recognized organizations. And here we can see an example difference of the attained EEOI and the attained CII score for a vessel. In most cases, the attained EEOI will be higher than CII because CII assumes that the vessel travels fully laden all the time, which is not true. So, which vessels are affected? Well, we said in our last webinar that the EEXI regulations apply to all vessels above 400 gross tons, but the CII regulations apply to all vessels above 5,000 gross tons. And starting from 2023, so what this means in practice is that the regulations will apply for the CII scores attained in the year 2023 and onwards, which are reported by the 31st of March the following year. So in practice, vessels will have to implement their operational carbon reduction measures throughout 2023 and before that, really, to achieve their desired score. So let's have an example of how this works in practice for a Supramax bulk carrier. 58,112 deadweight, travelled 71,949 nautical miles and consumed 7,300 tonnes of heavy fuel oil and 800 tonnes of diesel oil in a year. This is the data we need to put into the equation. And for this vessel, we have an attained CII of 6.77 grams of CO2 per tonne nautical mile. Now, this is the figure we need to use to find out which band, which CII band the vessel sits in. But first, we just need to do another calculation to define these bands, see where the bands actually lie. So to do that, first we calculate what's called the reference CII, based on the vessel's deadweight and type. So for a 52,000 deadweight ton bulk carrier, we have a reference CII of 5.53. And then we apply a reduction factor based on the year to this. For the year 2020, the reduction factor is 1%. I'll touch on these reduction factors a little bit in the next slide in a little bit more detail. So if you apply that reduction factor, we get a required CII of 5.48. This required CII is what we use then to define the limits of these bands, with this required CII score being sort of the middle of the C band, bands A, B, C, D, and E. And we look at our vessel's attained CII score from earlier, and we can see that it sits in band E for the year 2020. So before we move on to what these bands actually mean and what the sanctions and incentives are, I'll just briefly touch on these reduction factors. So here we can see the reduction factors that apply to the reference CII as they're calculated each year. And we can see that the reduction factors are constantly reducing the required CII year on year. So this encourages vessels to continually improve their CII also year on year. And as I mentioned earlier, the requirements come into force from 2023, meaning that the reductions applied before this is sort of only a guidance, and the whole regulation up to 2023 is a guidance. As we can see, the CII reduction is agreed up till 2026 at the moment, but not past that at this point. What do the bands mean? What do the actual CII bands mean? Well, quite simply, vessels in bands A or B will have no sanctions, and vessels might receive some incentives such as reduced port fees and maybe some green investment attractive to green investors. Vessels in band C, no incentives, but no sanctions either. Vessels in band D for 3 continuous years must develop what's called a carbon reduction plan, showing how the vessel will improve the CII score. This plan will have to be verified by a recognized organization. And vessels in band E for 1 year must develop this approved carbon reduction plan as well. So here we have a visualization of how the CII bands as they reduce every year. In this example, we have a vessel that has an attained CII for 2019 and 2020 that was in the middle of the C band. And if this vessel maintained its last CII score through to 2023, we can see that by the time the regulations come into force, it's fallen into the E band. If, on the other hand, the vessel starts implementing some carbon reduction measures that reduce its CII over 2021 and into 2022, and then maintains its lower CII, then the vessel would be in band D come 2023. So as you can see here, the goal of the IMO is to continually push vessels to keep improving their CII score and therefore reduce their carbon emissions. So how can a vessel actually reduce this CII score? Well, the CII score is effectively based on your fuel consumption. So to improve your vessel CII score, you've got to improve your fuel consumption, and you've got to do this in an operational way. So you've got to operate in a way that increases your vessel's efficiency, which can be done in a range of different ways, but the most impactful of which would be slowing down and effectively using less fuel in the main engine. If the vessel has an engine power limiter fitted to comply with EEXI regulations, it's quite likely that this forced reduction in speed will also have a positive impact on the attained CII, but it does depend on the average speed the vessel travels at anyway, and how the vessel operates based on its voyages and so on. You can change the fuel type as well to a less polluting fuel type, quite costly to implement, but will have quite an effective impact on the CII score. Alternative fuels, things like methane, LNG, ammonia. Other options include fitting fuel mass flow meters to more accurately measure the fuel consumption, therefore ensuring the reporting of is accurate. So the CII score is actually very accurate. Social energy measures, these are some you may be familiar with in your own home, turning off lights, reducing the air conditioning or heating, etc. And improving the power management system in the engine room so that the auxiliary engines, electrical distribution, power systems, they're being operated as efficiently as possible by the engine room crew. So looking ahead to how this will affect vessels, we are actually currently conducting an analysis of over 3,000 bulk carriers, tankers, container ships, and general cargo vessels. And we'll delve into that analysis in more detail in the next webinar. However, initial analysis of the bulk carriers showed that if these bulk carriers were to maintain their 2020 CII score through to 2023, we would see 33% sitting in bands D or E, with 30% sitting in band C. So this means that over 30% of bulk carriers will require operational interventions to reduce and improve their CII score by 2023. And with that, I will hand back over to Adam and Ben to briefly touch on some of the impact this will have in the industry in general.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation, Stefan. And I certainly hope that helped our audience to contextualize and improve their understanding on some of the more technical aspects of the upcoming CII regulations. Now, before we move on to the likely impacts, we'd like to ask our viewers a question. And today we're asking, how many of you who have a direct interest in shipping have started to compare your vessel CII bandings with the requirements, therefore ultimately getting an understanding as to whether your ships will be compliant or not come 2023. Your feedback is invaluable to us, and we'd appreciate as many answers as possible, and the results for which we'll come back to towards the end of this session. While that poll is running, I'll now hand over to my colleague Ben, who will be discussing some of the impacts that the carbon intensity indicator is going to have on our industry.
Thanks, Adam. I hope you're all keeping well. And as Adam mentioned, I'll be going through some of the impacts that we can expect from the new regulations. Whenever new regulations hit the market, there is always a balance between the cost of implementation and the operational impact. When we look specifically at complying with CII requirements, the initial thoughts of many ship owners is going to be how they plan to comply. Taking quick, tough action to comply in the A or B bands, or consistently complying in the C bands by slowly bringing their vessel into compliance as the regulations become tougher. We're going to have a look at some of these decisions and their impacts. I split these into 3 different sections: the impact of operational improvements, the issues around modernizing the fleet, and finally, the marketability of the fleet. Firstly, let's have a look at 2 operational changes that can be made and discuss some of their impacts. As discussed by Stefan, a major part of CII compliance will be achieved through the reduction of speed the vessels operate. There are a number of issues that companies will be thinking about when they consider slowing their fleet down. Mostly this will be the reduction in ton miles that a vessel will be able to achieve, and as such, a reduction in the number of charters that a vessel will be able to undertake. To give an example, let's assume the average voyage charter is 14 days. And to comply with the new requirements, a vessel would need to reduce speed by 25%. This reduction in speed would increase the days required, would increase the days required to complete the charter to 17.5 days, going from an ability to complete 26 charters in a year to 20. Simply put, a reduction in ton miles would mean a reduction in income for vessel owners. With this reduction in speed, there may also be issues in complying with previously agreed laycans. Although BIMCO issued a transitional clause in December last year, which provided a basis for parties to enter into negotiations around slowing down, there is no standard form clause to tackle this issue. Another option would be to change the operational procedures operated by ship's crew. This inevitably would include slowing down. However, other options, such as better maintenance, more competence regarding sailing more efficiently, enforcing better weather routing, and operating machinery more effectively, could be achieved through additional training and equipment. The issue here would be longer and higher training costs, as well as the time required to update standard operational procedures and ensuring their enforcement. So if operational changes are going to be challenging to balance, Maybe the option of newer tonnage would be better. New tonnage may also reduce pressure from lost ton mileage that vessels were previously able to achieve. The issue here would be the present new build landscape, which makes this difficult and expensive. Yard availability is low, and the current freight rates have given companies excess capital to be able to commit to more modern fleets. This has filled all the order books. The current yard availability also makes the modernization of fleets more challenging. The reality of being able to install these new technologies into older tonnage is that they will require major refit, which will most likely mean dry docking or at a minimum time out of the market. And as yard availability declines, the price to modernize will significantly increase. The nature of these new regulations means that all emission information for vessels becomes significantly more public. And so it isn't against the odds to consider that the public may have a new and renewed interest in the emissions that have been produced to receive their goods. We must then consider how the vessel will be marketable. Although not the intentional reason behind CII, it would be a mistake to disregard the attained grade as a possible requirement for chartering. This would be especially relevant for stock-listed companies who have significant environmental commitments, but would be just as important for smaller vessel owners and operators whose stakeholders require greener and faster transit. The just-in-time nature of many large retailers, partnered with their requirement to operate greener trade routes, will mean that the vessel's ability to comply with regulations and to complete voyages in their normal or faster time will become more challenging. This, partnered with the possibility that the bands a vessel operates in could become a major deciding factor when entering into charter, will make compliance essential. Regardless of the approach taken to comply with these regulations, it is likely that everyone in the industry is going to be impacted by these changes. It is highly recommended that everyone start assessing their fleet CII as soon as possible to prepare for the changes which are coming in 2023. I'll now hand back to Adam, who will take us through to the end of the webinar.
Thank you very much for that, Ben. And your final point actually leads us nicely into the results of our poll, where by the numbers, just 23% of our viewers today have started to get an understanding of where their vessels are in relation to the regulations. We cannot stress enough how important it is to start planning as soon as you can, since, as Stefan and Ben have explained, this is not just a one-off exercise, but one that will require continuous improvement. To help, Idwal have developed a decarbonisation report, which not only looks at your vessel's current CII, but also your EEXI scores, and will help determine whether your ships are compliant as of today, as well as the likely trajectories as we get closer to the regulations coming into force. Also included are a number of vessel-specific recommendations on the most effective measures that could be implemented on board, or technologies that could be installed in order to make the asset compliant. This can be added as a supplement to any Idwal inspection or produced as a standalone document, and it's been designed to help you plan for the upcoming changes, as well as demonstrating to your owners, investors, and other key stakeholders that you are taking a proactive approach to the decarbonisation of your fleet. If you'd like more information on this report or to request a sample, please do let me know after this webinar and I'll be happy to provide. And so that concludes the presentation aspect of this webinar. And we'll now move on to a Q&A session, for which I can see we have plenty already. Thank you very much for this. So if anyone else has any questions, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as we can. So first question of the day, where do I get the information to calculate the CII?
Where do you get the information to calculate the CII? Well, this information you already have to compile and send to the IMO DCS data collection service every year anyway. So this is the information you provide for your last year, and this is your fuel consumption, fuel type, and distance traveled. And this must be supplied to the IMO by the 31st of March the following year. So for example, the data for 2020 has to be supplied by 31st of March 2021, and so on. If you go into any EU waters, you must also supply the same data to the EU MRV monitoring, reporting, verification system as well. So that information is effectively how much fuel and type you've consumed and how far you've traveled in a year.
Perfect. Thank you, Stefan. And this leads on to another quite relevant question off the back of that. So just to clarify, the emissions data will be compared to its same regulation year. For example, 2023 emissions data will have to comply with the 2023 regulation year factor. Correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yes. I know it's confusing because sometimes the year that the data is submitted is the following year. But it's about the data, about the fuel consumed in 2023, and that will have to comply to the 2023 regulations. Effectively, the reporting is 1 year behind, effectively. But yeah, the actual measures taken to reduce the carbon and the CII score and the reporting of it and the comparison benchmarking of it to find out which band you're in, that is done all for 2023, for example, and then reported in 2024.
Great, I hope that helped to clarify. So one viewer says, I have a pre-swirl duct fitted. Will this reduce my CII?
A pre-swirl duct? Yeah, pre-swirl ducts, they are a hull energy saving device that sort of improve the flow through the propeller. They've been shown to have a range of efficiencies improvements, but it will affect, depending on the vessel type, depending on the pre-swirl, depending on the speed that the vessel usually travels, a lot of variables. But yes, they will likely improve the CII by a small amount, probably no more than 5%, maybe 10% at most.
Great. So one gentleman asks about the EEXI webinar. So if you missed the initial webinar, then this is available on our website, or if you'd like a more in-depth discussion, we're more than happy to take a further call after this webinar. Please do reach out. And another viewer says, what about ballast voyages and port stay?
Ballast voyages and port stay, for the CII, they are sort of ignored really, in the sense that it's simply the distance, the entire distance you've traveled and the dead weight of the vessel. So even though it's not really accurate in the sense that it's not fair to calculate the carbon for ballast voyages and port stays, it is applied to all vessels. So it sort of levels the playing field in that sense, but they're kind of ignored really. Ballast voyages and port stays, they will add to the distance traveled, but they won't affect the actual amount of cargo carried. So yeah, it's not going to, but it applies to every vessel, so it's fair at least.
Thank you very much for answering that question. So given the requirement for continuous improvement year on year, is there not an incentive for ship owners to do the bare minimum from the outset?
Given the requirement, effectively, you could argue it like that, but there are also these incentives to being in band A and B, so they may incentivize vessels to push further than compliance, and it's also to do with investment and the policies of the companies. Some companies may have, you know, quite stringent sustainability policies that require all their vessels to be in bands A or B because of the reduction in carbon that's required in the world at the moment. So if you look at it from a purely financial and incentive and sanction based on the CII band, I guess, yes, the bare minimum would be what you want to do, but there are other factors that may mean that you won't want to do the bare minimum.
Okay, and so a more philosophical market question. If, say, 1/3 of the bulk carrier fleet will start slow steaming, capacity available will dramatically be reduced. Freight rates will inevitably go up, also for the band E ships. So who will have an incentive to actually upgrade their vessels? Well,
it's not necessarily that you have to slow steam to comply with CII. You just have to, I mean, it seems quite basic, but you have to reduce the amount of fuel you use. Now, there are other options apart from slowing down. It's also, like Ben said, there's might be some weather routing things you can do, and so on, and maybe improving the power management. You might want to change fuels. So in those cases, you'd be able to maintain your speed, but also comply with your CII. So also a lot of the EEXI technologies that may be required for some vessels to comply with EEXI regulations, these will have a positive impact on the CII score. So a lot of vessels may decide that to comply with EEXI and CII, it might be in their interest to maintain their speed and invest in other technologies, these pre-swirl ducts, for example, or air lubrication technology, or whatever other technologies that mean you don't have to slow down.
Great, very interesting on that. Next up then, what would be the penalties of non-compliance for ship owners?
It's a good question. Non-compliance penalties are effectively, answer this question, I think a similar question this morning, is how we the industry's policed anyway, how other pollution control regulations are policed, which is by port state control and various things like that. So as we said, vessels in band E, for example, for 1 year will have to develop this carbon reduction plan, or enhanced SEEMP, sometimes known as. If they don't do that, then we can assume that port state will ask them why they haven't done that and then sanction them accordingly, be that deficiencies or detentions. So it's not very clear from the IMO yet, but the assumption is that this policy will be policed like any other regulation in the industry.
Great. Thank you very much for all those answers, Stefan. And of course, thank you all to our audience for those very, very interesting questions. And I do apologize that we didn't get around to them all, but if we didn't get to answer your question, please do contact us and we'll be happy to discuss in more detail. Again, I'd like to thank you all very much for listening. I do hope you all stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar in the Idwal Insights Climate Action Series.